Good evening, everybody. I'm Holly Nelson with the Development Events Office here at the Hotchkiss Library of Sharon. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're really pleased to see all of you. And just a reminder that if you've missed a bit of the beginning or such, we will have a recording of this up on our website in just a couple of days. I'll be ably assisted this evening by the library's executive director, Gretchen Hochmeister, who knows how to pull all the strings behind the scenes. Because of the terrific turnout, we've muted all the participants during the program. Following the conversation, there'll be an opportunity for comments and questions. Please put them in the chat box and we'll make sure that they get addressed. Tonight's program is just one in a series of interesting programs that we've got lined up. We've been very busy little bees here at the Hotchkiss Library. So please take a quick look at our website, www.hotchkisslibraryofsharon.org, and where you can both sign up for the events as well as our weekly e-blast. We are delighted to be joined this evening by Matthew Sturgis, who is zooming in from London. Happy to hear it's his second book event this evening, but we're just happy that we could make it all work out across the time zones. He is an Oxford-trained historian and biographer who also writes for the Times Literary Supplement, the Daily Telegraph. He spent much of his writing life in the era that we will be learning more about this evening. He's known for correlating his subjects' personal stories with the world around them. Sturgis spent the first part of the 20th century creating well-received biographies of illustrator and author Aubrey Beardsley and impressionist modernist painter Walter Sickert, whose lives and works, they were part of the same cultural world that both shaped and reflected Oscar Wilde. We are fortunate that Mr. Sturgis has turned his historian focus to a subject who many of us thought we knew well. In Oscar Wilde, A Life, he once again digs down deep to amplify details that show Wilde's development as a writer and whose outlook and work was shaped by the worlds in which he traveled. He also brings in several new sources that reveal even deeper layers in the story of this extremely complex figure. The Guardian described Sturgis as, quote, a tremendous orchestrator of material, fastidious, unhurried, indefatigable. And there's no one better to discuss Matthew Sturgis' monumental work than Victoria Wilson, vice president and executive editor at Alfred A. Knopf, and also editor of the American edition of Oscar Wilde, A Life. Vicki knows a great biography when she sees one, as she herself spent years researching and writing a life of Barbara Stanwyck, still true 1907 to 1940, whose 800 plus pages are a vivid portrait of the early life and career of this complicated American screen actress and her evolution as films went from talkies to full-blown Hollywood movie machines that shaped mid-century America. Victoria is arguably the premier publisher of literary and cultural biographies in America today. So here we are in our lovely little library in Sharon, Connecticut, about to hear two world-class biographers discuss one of the most interesting characters of our literary tradition. It's as if Oscar Wilde were here with us to note, to expect the unexpected shows a thoroughly modern intellect. Take it away.
Okay, am I heard now?
Yes, you are. You're all heard.
I can be heard as well.
Both of you.
Okay, we're in business.
Excellent.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to welcome everybody, and my dogs are welcoming you as well. So if they make noise, just ignore them. I first want to just say many thanks to Alice Quinn, the Sol Hurok of our time, for helping to organize this event. And to thank Holly Nelson of the Hotchkiss Library for putting it together, and to Gretchen, our tech expert. So before we begin to discuss Oscar Wilde, I had to do something. So out of deference to what is happening in Ukraine, I wanted us to pay homage to their most acclaimed poet, who was a man called Taras Shevchenko, who and was sort of, I had to sort of make a connection. It was sort of a contemporary of Wilde's. When he died, Shevchenko died in 1861. Wilde was 7 years old. But He's the foremost Ukrainian poet, painter, illustrator, ethnographer of the 19th century. And, you know, obviously from two completely different worlds, but each man bound by his art. So Oscar Wilde, and Wilde's writing and intellectual life spans a wide range of forms, from children's books to magazine editing. He's a playwright, essayist, letters, short stories, poetry, and of course a novel. And a modernist through and through, a man, I don't want to say he was born in the wrong time, but he certainly heralded a 20th century life and attitudes. And he lived a mere short 45 years from 1854 to 1900, but it was a short life of size, of drama, passion, anarchy, comedy, and tragedy. And it's sort of interesting. I mean, you know, if he had only lived a little while longer, the world might have caught up with him, because Queen Victoria died in 1901, which is what sort of beset him. And but, you know, when you put him in context, which of course we will be discussing, the Brontes were like the previous generation. And when you think of the contemporaries of Wilde, Dickens, George Eliot, Whitman, and then the sort of crossovers, Mark Twain, Emile Zola, Louisa May Alcott, Chekhov, and Longfellow. I mean, it's sort of interesting to put it in that context. So when I first read Matthew's manuscript, I have to say, and it was large, and I said, Oscar Wilde, does the world really need another biography of Oscar Wilde? And when I started reading this, the answer was absolutely yes, this is essential. Here was Wilde as I'd never read him before as a human being, not the legend, not the icon, not an exaggeration or a camp figure or a calcified monument etched in stone. He was being portrayed as a fully alive person, a man, and the aliveness of who he was and who he was becoming and the choices he makes, the choices he was compelled to make, that are so vividly portrayed in this book, make this book a singular achievement. So without question, this is the first biography of Wilde to come along in 3 decades since the publication of Ellman's monumental book. It is the most alive, most resonant, most dimensional portrait of Wilde's life to date, and the most vigorous in terms of putting the life in the context of the times. So Matthew, you started with Beardsley, Aubrey Beardsley, his critics called him Weirdsley Daubrey. And then you went to Walter Sickert, and a very important painter, one of the most influential figures in 20th century British art. And I'm curious to know why you started with Beardsley. Was it because Wilde was too large a subject, or because the other two led you inevitably to Wilde?
So I think the answer to that is both in a way. I mean, I think for starting out as my career as a biographer, and Beardsley was a fantastic figure to work on, because of course he had such a very short life. I mean, he died when he was only 25, and as I've learnt since, of course, the longer the life, the greater the task. But Beardsley's life is so brief and intense, and has really the arc of a much longer career, sort of condensed into the span of really half a decade almost. That it's a thrilling story to engage with, but also a manageable one. And of course, as a publisher, you'll recognize as well that I sort of came to write the book off the back of a sort of general study I'd done of the English decadence of the 1890s, when I'd sort of begun to map out the territory and realize the huge importance of Wilde, but also the importance of Beardsley in that sort of extraordinary decade of experiment and achievement. And I also realized that we were approaching the year 1998, which was going to be the centenary of Beardsley's death. So that if I was going to undertake the task, this would be a moment to grasp it, and I could try and write the book to coincide with that that event. So yes, all those things came together, and then this great sort of Wilde throughout my writing career sort of loomed as this great figure. I mean, he said, that it is personalities, not principles, that shape the age. And he really is the personality who shaped that late 19th century moment in a certain way. And but he is a mammoth figure, and I realized it would be a huge task to take him on, and also to sort of navigate around the fact that there had been other books about him. And I think it was really with the extension of the span of time that it became clearer and clearer that there was a real need for a new biography. So much interesting new material had become available. They discovered new documents, dozens of new letters, new ways of researching material had opened up with the proliferation of the there was both a need and an opportunity to try and bring it all together.
In reading your book, what was one of the things that I loved about it was the childhood and the detail that you have about, I mean, his parents were quite amazing figures, Sir William Wilde and Jane Francesca Speranza Wilde. Talk a little bit about them and about his childhood, because he had a kind of bohemian, enchanted childhood.
Yes, I mean, it was a childhood in Dublin. It was where he grew up, in this beautiful big house on Merrion Square. And it's certainly very interesting if you go to Dublin and walk through Merrion Square, and you perhaps know the number of Wilde's house, and you're thinking, now where is it? You approach it, and you see a blue plaque on the front of the house, and you think, oh yes, this is Oscar Wilde's house. I'm sure that the plaque will be announcing his the fact that he was born here or whatever. In fact, the plaque is announcing that Sir William Wilde, his father, had lived there, and underneath it says, Sir William Wilde, eye and ear surgeon, statistician, ethnographer, writer, antiquarian, cataloguer of the Royal Irish Institute's collection. I mean, one of those prodigious figures of Victorian energy and achievement. And he was really matched by the energy and achievement of his wife, Oscar's mother, this phenomenal figure, Jane Wilde, who wrote patriotic verse during the 1840s under the name Speranza, the Italian for hope. Her maiden name had been Elgie, and she'd convinced herself, because it was a slightly unusual name, that it must be a corruption of an Italian name, perhaps Algiati, she thought. And then as a short hop from that, she thought Algiati probably was a corruption of Alighieri, and so she must almost certainly be descended from Dante. And that sort of became part of her own imaginative sort of self-imaging. I mean, I'm afraid the historians and the genealogists have been to work, and Elgie turns out to be a fairly common name in county of Durham in northeast England, and she descended from a long line of brickmakers. But
those wonderful invention.
Yeah, bricks, yes.
No, I don't mean bricks. I mean her invention of hers.
I mentioned myself, yes, indeed. Bricks are wonderful too, though.
They come in handy, yes.
And but that sense of invention and imagination and the power of imagination and the power of words, because I mean, her patriotic verse had been enormously influential in stirring up nationalist sentiment in the years immediately after the appalling famine in Ireland. I mean, endured through her life and coloured the vision of her children. She had exalted ideas about their attainments and their possible careers. I mean, even when Oscar's elder brother Willie was sort of aged about 1 and she was rocking his cradle, she sort of peered into it and thought that he had very intelligent eyes and would certainly make his mark in the world and would possibly be the first president of an Irish republic, she thought. And pretty much as soon as Oscar could write, she was sort of hoping that he too would become a poet. And indeed, she was enormously encouraging to them and would read literature to them, introduce them to the works of Walt Whitman at a time when he was barely known outside America, and gave them a sort of both a sense of ambition and a confidence in their achievements that I think was really a very important factor in their lives.
Well, the other thing, I mean, that I also thought was quite wonderful in the book was your description. I mean, the detail that you have about the boarding school, Portora Royal School, that he went to and what he was like there. And then he went on to Trinity and then Magdalen. And that's, your description of that. I mean, tell us, you could talk a little bit about that, but I want to get to when he arrives, when he sort of ascends and descends into London. Alights, I suppose is the best word.
I mean, I think I felt it was important to give sort of due space to his education, because sometimes it's rather hurried over or
right,
condensed.
exactly.
Particularly his time at this school, the Royal School at Portora in Enniskillen, where he was there for 6-7 years, an enormous chunk of his childhood, and clearly these things are formative, even though in his later life he may not have talked about it. He may have once he got to England sort of slightly put his Irish boyhood behind him, but undoubtedly it had a huge impact upon him. And I suppose particularly, he was blessed in that he arrived at a time when there was a sort of brilliant teaching regime there, and he really became a first-class classical scholar through the teaching he received there, and that grounding allowed him to flourish and be a huge success, first at Trinity College Dublin, where he won prizes, and then he won a scholarship to Oxford and excelled there as well. And that sort of level of attainment and sort of noted academic achievement was something that sort of gave him a stable ground throughout his life. It meant that whatever sort of foolish caprices he might indulge in, whatever poses he might adopt, he knew that he was intelligent, but he knew that other people knew that he was no fool. He was a serious and brilliant intellect and a scholar, and I think all that leads back to this wonderful grounding that he got at Portora School.
And when he arrives in London after after being at Oxford and Trinity, and he has this bearing and sense of himself, and what happens, describe the early years when he lands in London and he begins to associate. Go ahead.
Yes, so, well, there was an extraordinary moment just when he was leaving Oxford, when he was sitting around with two of his contemporaries, and they were talking about, what are you going to do when you leave university? And, one of them was saying, well, he was going into his father's solicitor's firm in Bristol, and the other was having to go back to help manage the family estates in Scotland. And when it was Wilde's turn to say what he wanted to do, well, he said that he wanted to be famous, and if not famous, notorious. And I mean, it was an extraordinary vision then. The idea of fame as something separate from actual achievement. Of course, now it's become the greatest commonplace of the age, and we live in a terrible sort of universe of rootless celebrity. But then it was.
Did anybody even understand what that meant?
Scarcely. No, I mean, his friends stretched their eyes. He knew that, or he thought and hoped that the fame would derive from his literary endeavor. He wanted to write poetry or drama. But he had this sort of vision that being famous would assist him in this.
Well, in listening to this, I'm wondering, do you think it was connected to watching his parents who had that kind of fame and notoriety? The mother did.
I think so. I mean, interestingly, in the sort of contemporary records, the letters amongst their friends and acquaintances in Dublin, Sir William and Speranza are described as Dublin celebrities. I mean, the word is used. And so I think, yes, he did realize that it was, he did take from their example the idea of being a presence, a name, someone who was known for being a figure in that.
Well, he saw that his parents were the center of a society.
Yes.
Because they very much were. And so, I mean, he did write a book of poetry.
Well, he did, but really that came after this amazing campaign of self-promotion. I mean, the extraordinary thing was that within really 2 years of arriving in London, he had become famous. And he'd become famous through a sort of extravagant projection of his personality. And particularly as he'd taken on this role as being both the mouthpiece and the embodiment of the contemporary cultural fad, aestheticism, which really derived from the world of the pre-Raphaelites and their heirs, and the idea of the huge importance of art generally, but the way that art could be extended into other aspects of life, into obviously home decoration, but Wilde sort of extended the idea beyond and beyond that into sort of every aspect of life. So, he refused to take certain sorts of buses because he didn't like the color they were, or when he fell ill, he went to the local chemist and the chemist recommended some pill. And he said, oh, I think that's a horrible brown color. What about those beautiful golden pills in that jar? They look so beautiful.
Right.
I'm sure
that is carrying it to extremes.
And
but
so,
he go ahead.
And the fact that all the other figures connected with that movement, like William Morris or Swinburne or Ruskin, they were all a generation or half a generation older than he was. And they were shy of publicity. They didn't want to engage with the wider public and this rapidly proliferating press that was a feature of the late 19th century London scene. And so Wilde stepped into the breach and really achieved this position as the figurehead of aestheticism. And then having reached that pinnacle, he thought, okay, well, now I can parlay that into some literary success. And I think the shock that came to him, and it was a shock that probably assails modern day celebrities as well, was really how little his fame actually carried into the commercial world of culture, because he sent his poems out to various publishers and they all turned them down. And in the end, he actually had to pay for the production of the book himself.
Do you think the publishers had known of him? I mean, maybe it was because he was so.
No, but I think they knew of him only too well. I think they thought his Faustian pact had actually compromised him, and
right, exactly.
Yes, he was a sort of a foolish figure in a way.
So he at 27, he went on this, I don't know, vast 140, I don't know how many venue lecture tour of the United States, but wasn't he doing it for the Gilbert and Sullivan operetta to publicize Patience, which was sort of loosely based on him?
Yes. So the challenge of having achieved this fame was to turn it to some account, and he found that his publishing his poetry book had only been a very limited success, and so the idea of how to monetize his fame then shifted onto other ground, and it was decided that really a lecture tour would be the best way forward, and perhaps a lecture tour of America, where there was this great circuit for lectures, and where his fame had begun to spread. I mean, in that age when newspapers and magazines were expanding and proliferating the whole time, there was an amazing discourse and sharing of information between American and British papers, and indeed papers in South Africa, Australia, all over the English-speaking world. And so Wilde's fame had reached America. And also, the other thing that had reached America was Gilbert and Sullivan's new opera called Patience, which was a satire of the aesthetic movement. And in fact, the main character, this poet called Postlethwaite, was not particularly based on Oscar Wilde. It was rather more based on Swinburne, and the actor who played it looked like Whistler. But Wilde, as part of this campaign of self-promotion, had boldly said, "Oh yes, no, it's most definitely based on me." And he went to the opening night. He was seen sort of laughing extravagantly in the stalls, and sort of saying, "Well, these are the tributes paid by mediocrity to genius, that one should be travested in this way." And of course, the whole world of aestheticism was rather less well known in America than in Britain. And Richard Doyley-Carte, the promoter of the Gilbert and Sullivan operas, thought, well, people are enjoying the opera in New York already, and it's going to tour around the country. But they're just liking the tunes. They don't fully understand what aestheticism is. And there might be a real virtue in taking Wilde out to America to lecture on aestheticism, looking aesthetic, wearing knee breeches and a frilly shirt and a velvet jacket. And he would help promote and contextualize the opera, and the opera, by reflection, would help promote and contextualize him. And it proved a very effective ploy. I mean, he got very good audiences for his lectures, and attendances at Patience shot up and stayed up.
Well, I'd love to have heard some of the lectures: the English Renaissance, the decorative arts, the House Beautiful, Irish poets and poetry of the 19th century, the relation of art to other studies, etc. But what did he think of America, and what did he discover about America and about himself during that tour?
So, I mean, he adored his time in America. It was an amazing moment for him. His first time really away from home, looking after himself on his own, and feeling, I suppose, his own power and capability. He learned that the Americans were a practical people. After he'd given his lecture on the English Renaissance a few times, a friend in Philadelphia explained that really what the Americans wanted was sort of less philosophical disquisition about the roots of aestheticism as a creed, and more practical advice on what colour to paint their hallway and things like that. And so he tempered his opera, his lecture over the course of his time. He liked the energy of American women and their intelligence, and the straightforwardness of American men. Boston, I mean, he loved New York. People would get, wherever he went up the East Coast, people said, "Oh, but you'll love Boston." And he did love Boston. He was taken in and sort of looked after really by Julia Ward Howe. I mean, everywhere he went, he called on Longfellow as well, and wrote to him. He met Edison. Sadly, he didn't. The other person he wanted to meet was Emerson, but I think he died just before Wilde got there. And he met Whitman, and they had this sort of wonderful afternoon together. Which Whitman, of course, who was an adept of publicity, quite the equal of Wilde, then sort of managed to give a full account of to the local press. And he travelled across the country. I mean, he saw. He went down to the south, which he was very intrigued by. One of his mother's siblings, an uncle, had emigrated to America and had lived in Louisiana and had owned property there, but had died, I think, during the Civil War. I'm not as a result of the combat, but had been a figure in the South. And he travelled to California. He crossed America on a train, and he was just ravished by the beauty of California, calling it a very Italy without the art, as it was then. Of course, now it's full of art.
So, I mean, I think it's that year that he meets Constance Lloyd, and I mean, when he was, I mean, did you find anything? I mean, Whitman described their afternoon together, and was there any? I mean, Whitman wouldn't have said this, but was there any place that you found that there was some pull that Wilde had to him, apart from the power of the poetry?
Great. So I think he was sort of intrigued by sort of Whitman's sort of Greek energy. I mean, just the fact that he was such a sort of complete and true artist. So but I don't think there was a particular sexual allure there. And
no,
one of the curiosities of Wilde's pose during these years at the beginning of the 1880s was that although he was perceived and described generally as being rather effeminate with his velvet jacket and his long hair and his extravagant mannerisms, there was an understanding that this effeminacy and these traits actually made him enormously attractive to women, and certainly wherever he went, when there were receptions thrown for him in New York and Boston and places, he was literally mobbed. I mean, there are pictures in the press of him being surrounded by these adoring young females, all sort of hanging upon his lips, and in fact, during the sort of course of his trip across America, I mean, he lamented the fact that he couldn't stay in one place really long enough to fall in love as much as he wanted, but he claimed to have lost his heart in San Francisco, at least, to a woman who, from one surviving letter, appears to have been called Hattie. So, I mean, that was certainly a sort of a strain off his time in the States. And the same had sort of energy had really existed in the years in before he came to America, when he was in London. And it was just before he left for America that he'd first met this beautiful Irish girl, Constance Lloyd, who, you know, his family had known of before.
Oh, she was a writer.
No, she was.
She was a
very bright.
socialite.
She was very bright. No, she was. I think more of a blue stocking, really. I mean, she was.
Oh, interesting.
I mean, she hadn't been very formally educated, but she was a very good linguist. She loved. I mean, she knew Latin, but she loved Italian particularly. She read Dante and things, and was, yes, I mean, an intelligent and sort of self-willed individual. And also what was fortunate was that from her grandfather, she had inherited a large fortune, or was in the process of inheriting a large fortune. She already had a settlement on her, and her grandfather was in his 80s and ailing. So she was a catch. I mean, I don't think that was why Wilde was attracted to her.
Had he fallen in love with her?
I think he had fallen in love with her, his violet-eyed Artemis, as he called her. But I mean, so it was, yes, I mean, it was a proper match.
So what was there? What was quickly, because I've got a lot of questions, and I'm being prompted. I mean, it was a short life, but you know, there was a lot. Yes, he packed into it, and we just haven't even gotten to the.
Yeah. So they got married, and that was a fantastic thing. And then they really devoted a huge amount of energy to creating this beautiful house in Chelsea. I mean, far grander, really, than their resources should have dictated. But they wanted to follow some of the dictates that Wilde had laid out in his American lectures, and create a perfect aesthetic home, which they did. And then they thought they'd create some perfect aesthetic children, and they had 2 sons in quite quick succession, Cyril and Vivian. And this seemed, you know,
and it was like a conventional marriage. I mean,
it was a conventional marriage. These 2 children, and then it was sort of almost even more conventional. Wilde suddenly got offered a job. I mean, he'd continued his lecturing for a while after he got back from America, and then he'd started doing some journalism, but it was all fairly low-key, book reviewing and stuff. But then he was offered a job editing a women's magazine, The Woman's World, which, you know, offered him all the excitement of an actual income. And so I think there was this moment when he suddenly realized that or felt that, you know, a world of conventionality was settling around him. And it was sort of almost exactly at that point that he began to sort of chafe against those bonds. He'd been intrigued, I think, almost intellectually by the idea of homosexuality almost since his university days as a classicist. The whole study of Greek pederasty, a sort of element of classical life that had been rather obscured in the century before then, was just beginning to be discussed and investigated, and Wilde really was at the forefront of some of that research and intrigued by it. And that sort of intellectual interest began to chime with his own feelings and interests. And he was, I mean, as he always said, seduced by this much younger friend of the family, a boy really, Robbie Ross, who was probably about 17, 18 at the time.
He was a journalist, yes?
Yes, well, at that stage, he was still studying and about to go to university, but he became.
Be quiet.
But he was, I mean, he was very bright and able, and just had, well, from a really quite a young age, a very young age, had a sort of uncomplicated acceptance of his
Come here,
homosexuality.
Betsy.
And he, I don't know, yes, he obviously felt that there was an answering echo in Wilde's spirit in some way.
Well, I mean, you could talk for probably 3 hours on the connection of the classic, his classic, his ideas about Plato or classicism and the connection to homosexuality. But I have so many questions that I want to ask you. I can't ask them all to you. All right, dogs, enough.
We can say that it's all in the book. So
yes, we can say that, but just so it's fun to have a sense. I mean, yeah. I'm not going to, a question that I would like to ask, you don't have to answer it because I have to get to, I mean, I wanted you really to talk about what he did to that magazine, etc. But I wanted to ask you about his idea of socialism, if that was something that he believed in his entire life, and he believed, and about Ireland and about home rule and, okay, but skipping over ...
All those very well covered in the book.
And okay, 4 years of marriage. He writes The Happy Prince, but let's get finally, because I'm going to have to open it up to questions very soon, the sort of turning point, which is his first great success, The Picture of Dorian Gray.
Yes, so he that was sort of an amazing moment for him in that it was inspired by an American publishing house or American publication, Lippincott's monthly magazine, right, who'd made a great sort of feature that in each monthly issue they would publish a complete novella rather than running a serial over many issues, and they sent over the editor to London to get some British authors involved, because the magazine was published on both sides of the Atlantic simultaneously, but because it was based in Philadelphia, they'd up till then merely used native American writers, and they wanted to sort of expand their range. And this man, Mr. Stoddart, arrived in London, and the two authors, he thought he'd get some young authors. He'd known Wilde from his lecture tour in America, so he said, Oscar, will you meet me for dinner to discuss a project? And the other person he invited was a young writer called Arthur Conan Doyle, who'd just begun publishing stories, and his first novel had come out. And they had this memorable and happy evening at the Langham Hotel. And Stoddart had offered them, as it seemed, a princely sum to write a novella. And from that meeting, Wilde went off and wrote up the story of The Picture of Dorian Gray, a tale that he'd sort of begun to spin just amongst friends as a sort of exciting idea. And Conan Doyle went off and wrote The Sign of Four, the second appearance of Sherlock Holmes. So, I mean, it is an amazing cultural moment to think of.
I mean, it's all so alive. Okay, so we've got to get to, and then it's George Alexander who comes to him and suggests.
So, the excitement of The Picture of Dorian Gray, aside from the tale of the painting in the attic, growing old while Dorian remains young, is when you read the book, is the amazing dialogue in the opening chapters between the painter Basil Hallward, the young Dorian Gray, and Lord Henry Wotton, who is this sort of Socrates-like figure who sort of spins the philosophy of the new hedonism, as he called it, the idea that you could realize yourself through pleasure. And that dialogue is so sort of alive with wit and paradox and epigram, and so alive with Wilde's spirit. I mean, Wilde's great friend, Frank Harris, when he read the book, said, but Oscar, this is your conversation, that, this is like a condensation of your conversation over the last few months that you brought together in this, in these chapters. The theatre producer, actor manager, George Alexander, read the book, and he said, this is the sort of dialogue that would be electric on the stage. I mean, it's so funny, it's so clever, it's so immediate. And so he approached Wilde, and with the suggestion that Wilde should write a contemporary comedy. Wilde previously had written two plays, one a melodrama about Russian nihilists, which actually was premiered in New York and failed after a week, and the other a sort of 5-act cod Shakespearean tragedy called The Duchess of Padua, which nobody wanted to put on. And but he accepted Alexander's challenge, and really in a very short time produced Lady Windermere's Fan. And he read it to Alexander, who recognized its brilliance. He had some ideas on its structure, which of course Wilde, being a typical author, failed to take on board and fought against every step of the way. But the play was put on and was a huge success. I mean, from the sort of moment the curtain rose and the dialogue began to sort of flow out across the audience, the critics sort of who resented Wilde generally sort of tried to be mean-spirited about it and said, various of the plot devices derived from, Alexander Dumas or whatever. But basically they were just swept away by the tide of popular approval and excitement. And it was a thrilling moment. I mean, that was Wilde's first huge success, because although The Picture of Dorian Gray had created a sort of success to scandal in a way, it hadn't earned him a great deal of money because the rights were owned by Lippincott. But this, to have a play running in the West End, suddenly sort of, a sort of Niagara of money was crashing down upon him, which was thrilling. Of course, I mean, he did manage to spend more than he was earning, as he always did, but it did open up the world to him in a new way. And also, he realized that he had found it, in a way, his métier, and that he would be able to write another play, and possibly another play in this same genre, that it was something that came readily to him. And
this is the curtain for Act 1. So I don't see any questions. Do people have questions that you want to write in? Otherwise, I can go on. Holly, I don't know how much more time we have, if you want to let me know. I don't see any questions. So, before we get to, there is one, I just have to ask you this question because of Salome, and he had this intense friendship with Sarah Bernhardt. Yes. And calling her the divine Sarah. And he wrote his poem with Phaedra, which he dedicated to her, and etc. But what was that friendship? I mean, what an amazing combo. Yes. So she was this glamorous, exotic figure. He met her when really he was just starting out in London, and she had come over. She amazingly in that age, she would come over every year with her company and perform for a season in London,
in French. All the plays would be put on in French, and people would come up, you know, there were no surtitles or anything, but people, I mean, I don't know if they just knew French better then than they do now, or whether they just engaged with it at an emotional level, but they were hugely successful and exciting seasons. Wilde did speak French, and he sort of went out of his way to be her sort of young champion and to introduce people to her and her to people. And it proved an enduring friendship. And so when he had this idea of writing a play in French, a sort of symbolist drama, he'd been studying the sort of the new works that were being written by the Belgian symbolist playwright Maurice Maeterlinck. And Maeterlinck, of course, wasn't a French speaker himself. I mean, he spoke Flemish, but he wrote in this rather stilted French. And Wilde thought, well, here's, you know, I could write something in stilted French as well. And the story of Salome and John the Baptist is a tale that's long intrigued me, and he'd often played with alternate endings or plot lines. And so he produced this play script, and then thought that it would be ideal for Bernhardt. She was over in London at the time, and he took her the play, and she was, of course, thrilled and flattered that her friend, I mean, he said he'd written it for her. I don't know whether that was a sort of post facto justification, but and they sort of roused each other up to a state of great excitement about the possibilities of the production, and how, you know, what sort of costume she should wear, and whether they should have braziers of burning perfume in the stalls that, you know, were going to demark each scene with a different smell or whatever. But then the whole thing fell to the ground when the Lord Chamberlain, who at that time had to approve all plays, refused to give it a license on the slightly spurious grounds that there was an old 17th century rule law that said you weren't allowed to represent biblical figures on the London stage. And that was really an awful blow for Wilde, because it would have been such an artistic triumph to, you know, to have Bernhardt perform his play, a play that wasn't a society comedy on the London stage, that, you know, would have put him at the forefront of the artistic avant-garde. And yes, I mean, he was very upset and claimed that he, you know, might have to emigrate to France, where artists were better understood.
Only he had.
Yes, instead he went to Bad Homburg to take the waters and have a rest cure for a month.
So what's new, look, the whole portrait of Lord Alfred Douglas and their relationship is quite astonishing and rich in this book. And I'm not going to ask you about that, because you have to, everybody just has to read the book. It's in the library, it's in bookstores. But what's sort of a revelation is the trial, and you were able to get, you had the transcripts of the trials.
Well, yes, that was one of the amazing things that had come to light in the sort of in recent decades. And the year 2000 was, of course, the centenary of Wilde's death, and there was a nice exhibition about him at the British Library in London. And because of the sort of publicity and interest stirred up by that show, a woman came to the library with a plastic bag containing the complete transcript of the first of what Wilde ended up in court on 3 separate occasions, but the first occasion was the libel trial that he himself brought against the Marquis of Queensberry, Lord Alfred Douglas's father. Queensberry had left an insulting card at his club saying, you know, for Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite. And Wilde had sort of long been looking for really an excuse to try and get this man off his back by, you know, having some legal injunction placed against him, and had been sort of lured into taking a libel action against him. And the details of that first trial had always been known from sort of court reports in the papers, and that there was an abbreviated account of it which had been published. But suddenly this woman, out of her plastic bag, produced the complete transcript of that first trial. And it's an absolutely gripping sort of drama, really, that's mapped out. Gripping not least because the Queensberry's counsel, Queensberry's barrister, was a man called Edward Carson, who had been a classmate of Wilde's at Trinity, and was really one of the most brilliant lawyers of his day, and particularly brilliant as a sort of forensic examiner. And he really, over the course of page after page, sort of broke Wilde down, sort of asking him questions about his relations with these various young male prostitutes that his team, Queensberry's solicitors, had really remarkably and unexpectedly been able to track down, and they'd been able to put pressure on them to get statements which could then be used as part of Queensberry's.
But Wilde obviously didn't expect that that was going to be the case.
No,
Like
no,
he didn't. He's like he just totally didn't take it into consideration.
No, he thought that Queensberry's animus against him was entirely in relation to his relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas, Queensberry's son, and he thought, he was going to just have to defend himself on those grounds, and obviously he and Douglas would deny any sexual impropriety, and would give the most sort of platonic and sort of positive view on their friendship. And as far as the immorality of Wilde's writings, like the Picture of Dorian Gray, were concerned, Wilde was, used to defending them, on the grounds that there were no moral books or immoral books. Books were either well written or badly written, or whatever. And indeed, at the beginning of, Carson had very nearly not taken the case at all, and was all for advising Queensberry to, to plead guilty to the charge of the libel. And it was only sort of when these witness statements began to come in from the various rent boys that had been tracked down by the private detectives hired by Queensberry's solicitors, that the whole tenor of the case changed. And it was, as Wilde's friend Reggie Turner recalled, a sort of knockdown blow when 4 days before the trial was due to begin, Queensberry's solicitors delivered the plea of justification, as it was called, just listing all these encounters Wilde had had with various young men across London and Oxford and Brighton and wherever. And Wilde had no idea that this, his world was unraveling in this way. But by then it was too late to back out, and he had to sort of face the cataclysm.
Well, the detail in which you tell what happened and his time in prison, and Sue Norris is asking, he went to jail and wrote De Profundis as though he had learned something from the experience, but when he came out, what happened? And it's, what happened to him in jail, it just broke him.
Yes, I mean, of course, it did break him. I think physically it had a dire effect on him. I mean, just the hardship of it. A man who'd been used to luxury and comfort, having to spend 2 years sleeping on a plank bed with an inadequate diet and inadequate heat and medical attention and everything, was a blow from which undoubtedly hastened his end. And it destroyed his chances of returning to any sort of normal social existence, such as he'd loved in London and elsewhere. I mean, what's interesting is artistically, although it certainly did sort of curtail his creativity in some ways. I mean, the fact is, he wrote De Profundis. I mean, it's the most amazing document. I mean, in terms of its language, its thought, its sort of imaginative grasp of his situation. And then when he came out of prison, he followed that up by writing the Ballad of Reading Gaol, which again is another sort of extraordinary work, and turned out to be, the work, the book of his that sold most copies by far. But then after those achievements, I mean, he described the ballad as his swan song, and I think as he said, he found the architecture of thought sort of somehow beyond him. After that, he couldn't structure anything. He could still tell his wonderful stories. I mean, he was still remarkably good company. Friends would visit him sort of during his years of exile in France, in Naples, where he went briefly, and then in Paris towards the end of his life. And although, I mean, when writing to his friends, Wilde often would complain about the miserable existence he was living, principally in an effort to elicit more funds from them. Actually, the accounts of his friends who visited him really paint a sort of slightly different picture of somebody who'd found a quasi contentment, really, or a role that he could play. I mean, Augustus John said he seemed like an amiable but permanently overdrawn millionaire when he saw him, and he spent many or several happy evenings and afternoons of lunching or dining with him. So the absolute misery of his last years, I think, shouldn't be overstated.
Okay, my last question is a sort of two-parter, and we don't have a lot of time, so I mean, I hate to put this pressure on you, but, and I know it's 1 a.m. for you, so I appreciate this, but what did you come away from this book thinking about Wilde that surprised you?
I think one of the things was that how hard won his success was, that because he sort of presented such an air of insouciance and wit, it's sort of easy to believe that he's strolled through life enjoying one success after another until the terrible fall came, but actually he endured disappointments, he had doubts, he struggled, he worked enormously hard to achieve what he did, and then he worked enormously hard to conceal the fact that he'd worked enormously hard to do it. And so I think, yes, I mean, he deserves our respect enormously as an artist for that sort of endeavor and concentrated endeavor. And the other thing, I suppose, is just how wonderfully fresh his thought, his language, his engagement with ideas and stories remains. I mean, if you think of all those great Victorian figures,
Exactly.
19th century figures from Ruskin, Matthew Arnold, Walter Pater, Emerson, or whatever. I mean, they're not unreadable quite, but I mean they're largely unread, and you sort of slightly have to change gear to engage with them. But with Wilde, the dialogue is still sort of so direct and needs no mediation, and he speaks directly to the heart and the mind.
The second part of this question is, and again, we don't have a lot of time, so but I wanted to know, as somebody who's also written a book that was huge and took a lot of time, what did you learn yourself from writing the book?
I, I think the huge importance of chronology in telling a story, well, or revealing the secrets and the reasons for a character's behavior or and the incidents of their life. Is if you manage to arrange things in the right order, suddenly matters can fall into place. I mean, you realize what else was going on around them, or how being approached about one thing might spark them into doing something else. And so I think just yes, taking real care to build up the actual chronology of the story, and that, yes, I mean, also reveals, if you work from the ground upwards, I mean, the extraordinary elements of contingency in anybody's life. Things are not written in stone, and people aren't following a mapped out destiny. That they're making their own way. They're making mistakes along the way, and they don't know how it's going to turn out.
Matthew, thank you very much. And I just want to say to all those people who are thinking about reading this book, I will just say that in the UK, it was called, Matthew's book was called simply The Best Modern Biography of Wilde. The Times Literary Supplement called it the Book of the Year, perhaps the decade. And Waterstone said it's perhaps the richest, most compelling portrait of Wilde to date, the definitive account, not just of the man, but of his era. And the thing that I also want to say is that, because this is a fabulous quote, the Dublin Sunday Business Post called the book undoubtedly the most comprehensive, reliable, and clear-sighted study of Wilde ever likely to be written. But they also said a powerful sense of what it was like to actually know Wilde. And it's all, I don't know if you knew that quote, but.
No.
Okay, well, there you go.
I shall look it up. Thank you.
My gift to you,
Yeah.
and your gift to us with this book. And thank you, Matthew, and the Hotchkiss Library, and for this evening, and thank you all for coming.
And Victoria, thank you for masterfully leading us through a conversation that, on one hand, we were getting started, and
I just got started.
I know.
And here's the book, and you can see why.
Yeah. But that's part of what's enticing, is it's been a wonderful appetizer. And so now it's an opportunity for people to dig right into it. We do have, it is at the library. And you really just need to clear your calendar sort of between now and July and really take it in, because the detail is just so amazing. And the conversation between the two of you is a delightful view into the author editor process. So we just thank you both for everything. And
thank you.
It's just really both a remarkable story, remarkably told. So thank you for being here with us. To our audience, we will just